Marcus Donovan, the high-profile CEO of Argus Enterprises, boarded his exclusive corporate jet with a swagger that immediately set the tone for the flight. The attendants rushed to cater to his every need, offering drinks and meticulously arranged canapés. Seated quietly in a luxurious leather chair was Valerie Reyes, a marketing specialist whose presence Marcus had barely acknowledged until that moment. From his perspective, she was an unwelcome figure in a space he considered his alone. As the jet soared above the clouds, Marcus made a show of pouring himself an expensive whiskey, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler. The cabin lights reflected in his eyes, hinting at a simmering contempt. Without warning, he stepped toward Valerie and flung the remaining whiskey in her face. A hush fell over the few other passengers who were traveling with them, mostly Argus Enterprises executives and business associates. Shock radiated through the group, but nobody moved to intervene. "What makes you think you deserve a seat on my plane, Ms. Reyes?" Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. His words carried the weight of someone unaccustomed to being challenged, a man who believed he ruled every domain he entered. Valerie, initially too stunned to speak, wiped the whiskey from her eyes. She could feel it sting on her skin and in her pride. Although her heart pounded, she forced herself to stay composed, reminding herself that no amount of provocation could justify losing her cool. Despite the humiliation, she refused to wilt under Marcus's gaze. Marcus proceeded to lecture her on how Argus Enterprises had soared to success because of leaders like him, men willing to make the tough calls. He claimed that outsiders lacked the grit to thrive at his level and that Valerie, with her polite demeanor and professional restraint, would never earn a seat at the real decision-making table. The other passengers watched in uncomfortable silence, clearly wary of crossing Marcus. Some sipped their drinks and pretended not to notice the tension, while others exchanged furtive glances that betrayed their unease. The flight attendant, searching for a way to calm the situation, approached Marcus with a fresh glass of whiskey, hoping to defuse the tension. He waved her away dismissively, fixated on Valerie. The intensity in his stare was both unsettling and commanding. Finally, with a dismissive laugh, he hurled another stream of insults, calling into question Valerie's capabilities and ridiculing her education and background. Through it all, Valerie remained resolute. Her cheeks felt hot, both from embarrassment and from a slow-burning anger she struggled to contain. She made no move to fight back yet, the moment called for patience. Deep down, she knew she would have to handle this confrontation with a strategic mind, for Marcus Donovan's cruelty was not just an isolated incident, it was a symptom of his unchallenged power. And she was determined to show him he had sorely underestimated her. High above the clouds, within the opulent confines of Marcus Donovan's corporate jet, the air remained thick with tension after his brazen display of contempt. Valerie Reyes sat quietly, her mind racing through possible responses to the humiliations he had heaped upon her. A part of her wanted to lash out, to meet aggression with aggression, but she knew such a move would only confirm Marcus's skewed notions about who she was. She needed a smarter, more measured approach. Marcus turned his attention to the other executives, loudly proclaiming that people like Valerie were unfit for the rigors of corporate leadership. He boasted about how he had transformed Argus Enterprises into a global powerhouse, implying that only the most ruthless strategies could sustain such success. His colleagues nodded mutely, none daring to contradict him. Some discreetly glanced at Valerie, their expressions tinged with pity or guilt, but no one voiced support for her. Valerie inhaled, steadying her nerves. Then, in a calm voice that contrasted sharply with Marcus's rant, she spoke up. "Mr. Donovan," she said, "I realize this environment might feel like it belongs to you alone. But I'm here because I was invited by Argus Enterprises. Regardless of what you think of me, I intend to respect that invitation." Her statement was measured, neither too submissive nor overtly confrontational. Marcus arched an eyebrow, intrigued but hardly softened. "Invited, yes, but not welcomed," he retorted. "You do well to remember the difference." A few uneasy chuckles passed through the cabin, but Valerie pressed on. "I wonder if you're aware of how your presence affects the people around you," she continued. "True leadership, in my experience, isn't just about controlling a room. It's about earning trust and respect, not by force, but by genuine engagement. One of the other passengers, a middle-aged director named Harold Fenton, cleared his throat. He had built a reputation within Argus Enterprises as a level-headed executive, one who valued team harmony. Though he rarely challenged Marcus, Harold felt compelled to speak. "Valerie is right about engagement," he said, his gaze flitting nervously between Marcus and Valerie. "We've been exploring new business strategies that pivot on collaborative input. She's been brought on board to help with that." Valerie offered Harold a subtle nod of gratitude, while Marcus glared daggers at him. For a brief moment, the cabin fell silent. A storm of emotions played across Marcus's face: disbelief that someone else had sided with Valerie, indignation at the challenge to his authority, and an undercurrent of wounded pride. His next move was to dominate the conversation further. He stood, making a point to tower over both Harold and Valerie. "I appreciate your attempt to intervene, Harold," Marcus said in a tone laced with sarcasm, "but let's not pretend we're all here for a feel-good session on corporate culture. Argus thrives on results. And I've seen no proof that Ms. Reyes's so-called expertise amounts to anything more than fluff." Unperturbed, Valerie folded her hands in her lap. Her voice remained steady. "I've prepared a detailed proposal outlining how Argus can expand internationally without sacrificing employee well-being or ethical principles. It's a strategy that balances profit with sustainable growth. I'd be happy to share it with you, if you're interested." Marcus's laugh was a low, scornful rumble. "Ethical principles? Sustainable growth? You sound like you belong in a social work conference, not on the plane of a Fortune 500 CEO. His words stung, but Valerie caught a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. Despite his derision, he was listening. Before anyone could respond, the jet encountered a patch of turbulence that rattled trays and glassware. An attendant hurried to secure loose items, while Marcus maintained his stance, gripping the back of an armchair for balance. The abrupt jostle seemed to intensify the air of unease. Valerie seized the moment to refine her approach. "Mr. Donovan, my expertise isn't about dismantling the success you've built. It's about preserving and enhancing it. If Argus is to remain competitive, it must adapt to the changing demands of the global market. And that includes acknowledging evolving standards for ethical conduct." For a heartbeat, Marcus held her gaze in silence. Then he broke away, turning sharply to stare out the window as though the cloud-filled sky offered more agreeable company than the people around him. The tension among the passengers crackled like static electricity, but no one dared break the silence. Finally, Marcus spoke, keeping his back to the group. "We'll see," he muttered. "I'm not making any promises, especially after the disrespect I've witnessed. But if you think you can prove your worth, Ms. Reyes, then by all means, try." Valerie exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She understood that Marcus saw her as a threat, or maybe just an annoyance he needed to crush. Yet the fact he had conceded even a sliver of a chance to demonstrate her ideas spoke volumes. It was far from a victory, but it was a starting point. Harold and a few others exchanged hopeful glances. The undercurrent of hostility still ran deep, but a subtle shift had taken place. Through a poised, methodical response, Valerie had planted a seed of doubt in Marcus Donovan's mind. For a man who prided himself on crushing opposition, any sign of doubt was significant. The journey ahead would be fraught with conflict, but at least now, Valerie sensed a path forward. She quietly vowed not to waste the opportunity, no matter how small it might be. The corporate jet continued its journey, engines humming steadily as it sliced through the skies. Inside, an uneasy calm had settled. Marcus Donovan sat in a leather seat near the front, reviewing documents on his tablet, though he occasionally glanced up to throw hostile looks in Valerie Reyes's direction. She remained composed in her seat, mindful of the words she had exchanged with Marcus. Each breath she took carried the weight of the power struggle that simmered just below the surface. As the flight wore on, the attendants drifted in and out of the cabin, topping off drinks or offering light refreshments. Most of the Argus Enterprises team engaged in hushed side conversations, careful not to provoke Marcus. Harold Fenton lingered at Valerie's side, attempting small talk to ease the tension, but his efforts only partially succeeded. Valerie was polite, but she was also preoccupied. She sensed that Marcus was planning something. His arrogance wasn't going to let her off so easily. Eventually, Marcus strode to the middle of the cabin and addressed everyone with a forced smile. "We have about 2 more hours in the air," he announced. "Why don't we make use of our time? Ms. Reyes, why not present this grand plan you keep talking about? Show us all what you've got." A hush fell. Valerie could feel her pulse quicken. She knew this wasn't a genuine invitation but a challenge. Marcus intended to catch her off guard and watch her fail in front of an influential audience. Rising from her seat, she carefully collected her notes and moved to the informal gathering area, where a small table and a monitor could be used for presentations. "All right," she said calmly. "Let me just set up." She began by connecting her tablet to the monitor. The screen illuminated, displaying a title slide, "Argus Enterprises, Ethical Growth for a New Era." At once, Marcus snorted, drawing a smirk from a couple of his closest associates. Valerie, however, refused to be rattled. She clicked to the next slide and started her overview. "Argus has achieved remarkable success in the domestic market," Valerie explained, nodding politely to Harold and the others. "But if we want to replicate that success globally, we need to adapt. My proposal incorporates 3 main pillars: transparent governance, sustainable resource management, and community-focused investments. These strategies are designed to reduce regulatory risks while improving public perception, key factors in international expansion." Marcus made a show of tapping his foot impatiently. "And how exactly do we measure these intangible perception benefits?" "Talk is cheap, Ms. Reyes." Valerie anticipated his question. She clicked to a slide filled with data and case studies. "Here, I have examples from comparable corporations that pivoted to more transparent operations. Over time, they saw increased brand loyalty, higher employee retention, and fewer costly legal battles. In other words, ethical practices can directly impact the bottom line." A ripple of interest stirred among the executives. Several leaned forward, scrutinizing the data. Marcus, though, kept his arms folded. "So you're saying we should bend over backward to please a handful of critics?" Valerie held his gaze. "Not critics, Mr. Donovan, stakeholders. Local communities, future employees, potential partners. The global marketplace has changed. Consumers and regulators alike demand accountability." Sensing an opening, Harold spoke up, pointing to a bar chart on Valerie's slides. "These figures, are they from Argus's own departments?" "Yes," Valerie replied. "I interviewed several division heads, analyzed internal reports, and combined that information with external research. Everything is tailored to Argus's specific operations." At that, a few others murmured, impressed that Valerie had gone to such lengths. Marcus's jaw tensed. "Well researched, Ms. Reyes," he said icily. "But let's not pretend this is all sunshine and rainbows. Such a radical shift would cost us millions in upfront expenditures. Where's the immediate return on investment?" Valerie took a measured breath. Short-term profits might not spike immediately, but the mid to long-term returns could be substantial. By mitigating legal risks, building stronger community ties, and attracting top-tier talent, Argus stands to profit far more sustainably. A crisis of public trust can decimate a company's value. Just look at how scandal-ridden competitors have fared. Marcus pressed his lips together, refusing to concede even a minor point. "And what if I'm not interested in taking the scenic route? What if Argus wants to maintain its current growth trajectory without pausing to placate squeaky wheels?" She calmly shifted to another slide. "Then I'd urge you to see this not as placating, but as strategic adaptation. Industries evolve, consumer behaviors shift, and companies that refuse to evolve eventually crumble. Let's consider Argus's future, not just the next quarterly report. A prolonged silence filled the cabin. Marcus stared daggers at Valerie, but her unwavering composure seemed to deflect his hostility. Around them, the Argus team appeared intrigued, some even nodded in cautious agreement. Marcus clearly recognized that her plan had merits, even if he despised the idea of anyone but himself setting the agenda. At last, Marcus released a short, mirthless laugh. "That's quite the optimistic view, Ms. Reyes," he said. "But don't mistake caution for acceptance. I still think your approach is naive." Undeterred, Valerie responded, "I appreciate your honesty. I'd be happy to provide more in-depth numbers or schedule a follow-up session to answer any concerns." He waved a dismissive hand. "We'll see." With that, Valerie ended her presentation. She returned to her seat, her heart hammering in her chest. While she knew she hadn't exactly won Marcus over, she took solace in the fact that she had seized an opportunity to show her expertise. The other executives had seen her data, her logic, and her steady demeanor under pressure. Marcus might continue to belittle her, but he couldn't entirely dismiss what she delivered. As she packed up her notes, a young associate, Claire Hayes, leaned over and whispered, "That was brave. Most people don't stand up to Mr. Donovan like that." Valerie managed a small smile. "I'm not here to fight with him. But I'm also not here to be silent." The rest of the flight continued in subdued fashion. Marcus returned to his seat, occasionally muttering to a couple of his most loyal lieutenants. Harold offered Valerie a few quiet words of encouragement, promising to back her approach at the next board meeting. Claire lingered nearby, curiosity shining in her eyes. Bit by bit, it felt as though Valerie was carving out a space where her voice could not be ignored. Even so, a persistent unease flickered at the back of Valerie's mind. She hadn't missed the fleeting looks Marcus exchanged with his right-hand man, Tom Alden, a tall, broad-shouldered executive who had remained mostly silent so far. Something about Tom's calculated gaze suggested that he was more than just a yes man, he was a problem solver, perhaps even a fixer, for Marcus's more underhanded agendas. Valerie sensed a warning in the quiet tension between them. If Marcus was determined to undercut her, Tom Alden would be the enforcer behind the scenes. As the jet glided closer to its destination, the sky turning golden with dusk, Valerie realized her real work was only beginning. Convincing Marcus Donovan was merely the first hurdle. Somewhere beyond this flight awaited a series of board meetings, negotiations, and potential conflicts that could determine not just the future of Argus Enterprises, but also Valerie's professional reputation. And if Marcus had any say in it, she would fail spectacularly. But that resolve she carried, that belief in her own methods, remained unshaken. If Marcus wanted a battle, he would get one, and Valerie intended to stand her ground. Touchdown at the private airstrip came without fanfare, yet the atmosphere on board felt charged, as if everyone were bracing for what might unfold next. The pilot taxied to a discreet hangar owned by Argus Enterprises, and the flight attendants quickly began assisting the passengers. Marcus Donovan was the first to stride off the plane, exuding an air of unquestioned authority that set the tone for his entourage to follow. Valerie Reyes gathered her belongings methodically. She had given her presentation, and while it seemed to pique some interest, Marcus's skepticism remained palpable. As she descended the steps onto the tarmac, she felt the hot gust of desert wind and a jolt of adrenaline. It wasn't just her job at stake, it was her sense of self-worth, her capacity to hold her own in a cutthroat environment. Standing near the hangar's entrance, Harold Fenton waved her over. "Cars are waiting to take us to the resort," he said, referencing the exclusive retreat center where Argus executives often held strategic summits. Marcus arranged a series of meetings, but no one's certain what he has planned. "He just told us to be prepared." Valerie nodded, stepping into a sleek SUV with Harold, Claire Hayes, and another executive named Darren Liu. None of them spoke about the earlier confrontation directly, but the tension was obvious. Marcus had belittled Valerie in front of everyone, first by throwing a drink, then by mocking her proposals. Harold looked uneasy, Claire kept glancing at her phone, and Darren stared pensively out the window. Valerie realized they might be worried not just for her but also for themselves. If Marcus felt threatened, retribution could ripple through the ranks. When they arrived at the sprawling resort, they were met by hotel staff who whisked them through marble-floored corridors into a lavish lounge. Marcus and his closest confidants were nowhere to be seen, which added another layer of uncertainty. A quick text from Harold revealed that Marcus intended to host an informal evening gathering, no suits or ties required. The message felt strange, especially given the day's events, but Valerie decided to roll with it. She changed into more comfortable but still professional attire, mindful that any misstep could fuel Marcus's disdain. Around 7 o'clock, she made her way to the lounge where the informal gathering was supposedly underway. She found Marcus standing near a fireplace, surrounded by a small circle of senior managers. He held a glass of dark liquor and gestured animatedly, his voice carrying even through the hush of the elegant room. The others around him nodded or laughed on cue, a synchronized performance of feigned enthusiasm. Sighting Valerie in the doorway, he waved her over with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Reyes," he said loudly, ensuring that the group's attention turned her way. "Glad you could join us. We were just discussing the so-called ethical expansions you laid out during the flight." Valerie braced herself. The conversation was likely a trap. Still, she gave Marcus a courteous nod. "I'm happy to elaborate on any points that may need clarification." He swirled his drink. "I'd like you to elaborate on something else, actually, your background. We all know you have some professional experience, but how well do you really know Argus Enterprises? How can you be certain your ethical approach won't sabotage the very growth we thrive on?" Valerie felt a prickle at the back of her neck. "I've done extensive research," she replied calmly. "I've also consulted for firms in similar industries, including a few that pivoted to more transparent, sustainable practices. The results speak for themselves." Marcus tossed back the rest of his drink and placed the empty glass on a nearby table. "Research is one thing, Ms. Reyes. Internal knowledge is another. Perhaps you don't realize that Argus doesn't just do business in boardrooms. We negotiate in tough markets, handle high-stakes deals, often in parts of the world where a handshake matters more than a contract." Valerie stood firm. "That's exactly why a solid ethical foundation is critical. When trust is established in volatile markets, you minimize risk and secure more lasting alliances." A flicker of irritation crossed Marcus's features. He motioned to Tom Alden, who stood like a sentinel off to the side. "Tom here has brokered deals in some of the toughest regions on the planet. Isn't that right?" Tom, a formidable presence with a stern gaze, nodded. "We've done what's necessary to protect Argus's interests, yes." Marcus smiled coolly at Valerie. "Sometimes, Ms. Reyes, what's necessary isn't exactly squeaky clean. We can't always play by the rules if we want to stay on top." Silence fell as the gathered managers waited to see how Valerie would respond. She drew in a measured breath. "I won't argue that the global playing field can be messy. But ignoring standards of decency can lead to public scandals, legal actions, and heavy fines. Not to mention the erosion of trust from partners and customers." Her words hung in the air. Marcus's face was unreadable, but Tom Alden's jaw tightened. Harold, Claire, and Darren had joined the group, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. If Valerie was rattled, she refused to show it. Eventually, Marcus broke the silence. "Well, we'll see how your theories hold up in the real world. Tomorrow, I've scheduled a field visit to one of our local operations. You'll join me, Ms. Reyes, so you can see firsthand what Argus is dealing with on the ground. Prepare yourself." He turned away and headed to the bar, effectively dismissing her. Valerie blinked, caught off guard by the abrupt shift. She'd known to expect obstacles, but a sudden trip to a local operation felt suspicious, especially given Marcus's hostility. Yet the chance to witness Argus's practices in person might also work in her favor. She could gather real-world insights, strengthen her arguments, and possibly discover the source of Marcus's deep-seated aversion to her approach. Harold stepped up beside her, lowering his voice. "Watch your back," he whispered, genuine worry evident in his eyes. "Marcus doesn't usually invite consultants to on-site visits, especially not so soon. This might be about more than just your proposals." Valerie nodded, heart pounding. She sensed the same thing. Marcus was planning something, and she had no illusions it would be pleasant. But if she backed down now, she'd confirm every scornful assumption he held about her. Instead, she allowed herself a moment to steady her resolve. She would go on this field visit and see whatever Marcus wanted to show her, no matter how harsh. For the rest of the evening, she kept a low profile, occasionally chatting with Claire and Darren but avoiding further confrontations with Marcus. The other executives dispersed slowly, drifting into smaller conversations or retiring to their rooms. By the time Valerie finally left the lounge, the night sky was a velvet tapestry dotted with stars. A warm breeze followed her along the outdoor path to her suite, where she collapsed onto the bed. Her mind whirled with the possibilities. Where exactly was Marcus taking her? Would she be safe? Could she glean valuable information to strengthen her case for ethical reform? Sleep came fitfully, fraught with questions she couldn't yet answer. One thing, however, was certain: the confrontation that had begun on the jet was far from over. And in the morning, Valerie Reyes would be forced to meet it head-on, ready or not. The sun's rays filtered through gauzy curtains, waking Valerie Reyes from a night of restless dreams. She dressed in practical attire, sturdy shoes, lightweight pants, and a collared shirt, unsure of what Marcus Donovan's field visit might entail. Anxiety churned in her stomach as she pictured possible scenarios: a sweltering factory floor, a remote mining site, or even some underground operation Argus Enterprises quietly managed. She tucked her tablet into a messenger bag, ready to record any observations. A call from Harold Fenton came just as she slipped on her shoes. "Valerie," he said, sounding tense. "Marcus wants us in the lobby in 10 minutes. There's a convoy of vehicles waiting. Be careful out there." "I will," she promised. "Thanks, Harold." Downstairs, she found Marcus and Tom Alden in a heated discussion beside two black SUVs. The rest of the group comprised a few Argus security personnel and a driver. Marcus barely acknowledged her arrival. His gaze was distant, locked on some internal calculation only he understood. They set off on a winding road that quickly transformed from well-paved streets into dusty backroads. Towering cacti and scrubland extended in every direction, the desert air shimmering with heat. Valerie kept glancing at her phone, but the signal was patchy. At one point, Marcus glanced over from the front seat, noticing her concerned expression. He smirked, offering no reassurances. If anything, the faint glint in his eyes suggested he relished her discomfort. Eventually, they arrived at a fenced compound surrounded by tall, razor-wire-topped barriers. A large sign reading, "Argus Secure Facility, Authorized Personnel Only," hung prominently at the entrance. The gate slid open after a brief exchange between Tom Alden and a uniformed guard, and the convoy rolled inside. Valerie's first impression was one of starkness: rows of low-slung buildings baking under the desert sun, with security cameras perched at every corner. "This is one of our specialized research and storage sites," Marcus said curtly, stepping out of the SUV. "We hold sensitive materials here, prototypes and the like. I thought you'd appreciate seeing the real Argus, beyond polished boardrooms and fancy PowerPoint slides." Valerie hoisted her bag over her shoulder. "I appreciate the opportunity," she replied, though she sensed the implicit challenge in his words. He was testing her, daring her to find fault in whatever secrets this place held. Tom led the group through a series of checkpoints, scanning badges and passing fingerprint scanners. Each step hammered home just how serious Argus was about security. Once inside the main building, they donned visitor badges and were escorted by a stern-faced supervisor named Mia Bradshaw. The corridors were narrow and brightly lit, with reinforced doors that required electronic keycards to unlock. Mia guided them into a large storage area partitioned into sealed sections. Various crates and containers lined the walls, each labeled with cryptic product codes. Some compartments bore hazard symbols or locked steel shutters. Valerie's curiosity piqued. Whatever Argus was keeping here, it wasn't ordinary office supplies. Marcus lingered near a set of tall metal cabinets, watching Valerie's reaction. "This facility is at the heart of our upcoming ventures," he said. "Cutting-edge technology, advanced prototypes, and, yes, potentially risky materials. This is where real innovation meets necessity. And sometimes, Ms. Reyes, necessity demands we operate in gray areas." Valerie scanned the environment, noting the hushed efficiency with which employees in lab coats cataloged items. She remained outwardly calm. "I'm not here to judge Argus's pursuit of innovation," she said carefully. "My aim is to ensure these processes remain transparent enough to avoid catastrophic failures, be they legal, ethical, or environmental." Marcus's eyes flared. "Catastrophic failures, He nodded toward Mia. "Show her the wings, would you?" Mia hesitated, then led the group to a side chamber behind a heavy sliding door. Inside, Valerie saw a half-finished drone prototype with sleek metal wings spanning nearly 12 feet. Tables were strewn with circuit boards and mechanical parts. "This drone could carry cargo across remote regions," Mia explained in a subdued voice. "It's designed for speed and stealth, primarily for delivering crucial supplies where traditional vehicles can't go." Valerie moved closer, impressed despite herself. "And how close is it to operational?" Mia exchanged a glance with Marcus. "Still in testing. The prototypes are stable but not quite combat-ready, if that's what you're implying." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Combat-ready? We prefer to say we're preparing for multiple usage scenarios." Valerie exhaled slowly, realizing Argus might be dabbling in potential military contracts. "I see," she said. "And what oversight measures are in place to ensure these drones aren't misused?" Marcus's expression hardened. "As the CEO, I am the oversight. We follow regulations when feasible, but we can't afford to be paralyzed by red tape. Our clients expect solutions, not excuses." The tension in the room spiked. Harold and Claire, who had arrived in a separate vehicle, quietly slipped into the back of the group, their features taut with concern. They too sensed Marcus's provocative stance. Before Valerie could respond, the shrill beep of an alarm pierced the air. A red light flashed overhead. Mia cursed under her breath and rushed to a control panel, swiftly entering a code. "Just a containment alert," she muttered. One of the storage containers triggered a sensor. Marcus rolled his eyes. "We've had false alarms all week. Probably a temperature fluctuation." Nevertheless, he waved Tom Alden forward. "Go check it out, Tom. Make sure everything is under control." Tom nodded and disappeared through another set of sliding doors, leaving the rest of the group in uneasy silence. Marcus eyed Valerie, waiting for her reaction to the sudden alarm. She forced herself to remain steady, despite the ominous feeling creeping in. Mia quickly closed the drone chamber and guided them back into the corridor. "We can wait in the observation room," she suggested. "It's more comfortable." The observation room was a stark, glass-walled space overlooking a large, sealed vault. Banks of monitors displayed security feeds from every corner of the facility. Valerie noticed multiple screens focused on employees in lab areas, mechanical workshops, and even what appeared to be a subterranean level. Argus's operations here were undoubtedly extensive. Marcus leaned against a table, crossing his arms. "You wanted to see how Argus truly operates. Well, Ms. Reyes, this is it, a constant race to push boundaries while maintaining enough secrecy to protect our competitive edge." He paused, letting the hum of the equipment underscore his words. Tell me, does your ethical expansion blueprint account for critical projects like this? Valerie considered her response. Ethics doesn't mean halting innovation, Mr. Donovan. It means establishing guidelines that reduce the risk of catastrophic misuse. If these drones or any other high-stakes technology fell into the wrong hands, or if Argus bypasses oversight, the repercussions could be severe. He snorted. You talk as if I run an arms dealership. I'm saying the line between legitimate research and potential harm can blur quickly, she replied softly. Accountability is crucial. That's why transparency is a shield, not a shackle. A dark flicker passed over Marcus's features, but he kept his composure. Harold dared to speak up. Valerie's point stands, Marcus. We've faced scrutiny before, like that scandal 2 years ago with undisclosed experiments. We can't afford another blow to our public image. Marcus turned his withering gaze on Harold. No one asked you to chime in, Fenton. Harold's face tightened, but he maintained a respectful tone. I'm only trying to safeguard Argus from the kind of meltdown we've seen take down other corporations. We can't keep turning a blind eye. Before Marcus could retort, Tom Alden returned, nodding to Mia. False alarm, he confirmed. Some sensor glitch in the secondary containment unit. Marcus relaxed slightly, though the scowl never left his face. All right. Since we're all here, let's take a short tour of the lower level. That should satisfy Ms. Reyes's curiosity. Valerie's pulse quickened. This short tour felt less like a courtesy and more like another test or perhaps a subtle intimidation tactic. But she had come this far. Lead the way, she said, meeting Marcus's gaze with unwavering resolve. As they descended via a freight elevator, the air grew cooler, and the sense of secrecy intensified. Valerie couldn't shake the feeling that each step deeper into Argus's underbelly was one further into a world Marcus had carefully controlled for years. Whatever truth she discovered here, it might not only reshape her consulting approach but also put her directly in Marcus Donovan's crosshairs. Yet, in that moment, she resolved not to blink. If Argus was balancing on a precarious ethical precipice, she needed to see it with clear eyes. The freight elevator rattled to a halt, and its doors slid open onto a corridor lit by glaring fluorescent lights. Valerie Reyes stepped out behind Marcus Donovan, Tom Alden, and the rest of the group, her heart thrumming with both apprehension and curiosity. This lower level of the Argus secure facility had the feel of a place rarely seen by outside eyes, stark concrete walls, heavily reinforced doors, and an omnipresent hum of machinery that pulsed through the floor. Marcus motioned for everyone to follow him down the hall. Let's be efficient, he said coldly. I assume you have plenty of questions, Ms. Reyes. Feel free to ask, though I reserve the right not to answer. Valerie glanced at Harold Fenton, who offered a strained smile. Claire Hayes was behind them, taking in every detail with wide-eyed vigilance, and Darren Liu lingered near the back, arms crossed. Mia Bradshaw led the way, swiping her keycard at each checkpoint. They entered a large, cavernous chamber lined with rows of metallic storage pods. A faint chemical odor hung in the air, and the temperature was noticeably cooler. Valerie spotted men and women in white lab coats moving between the pods, scanning barcodes and entering data into handheld devices. This is where we store sensitive materials for ongoing research, Mia explained, her tone professional yet guarded. Some are chemical prototypes, others are advanced composites. High-level secrecy is essential. One researcher stepped forward and greeted Mia, casting suspicious glances at the newcomers. Valerie noticed Argus security badges pinned to the researcher's lab coat, signifying a clearance level above the ordinary. Whatever was housed here, Argus clearly deemed it vital, and potentially dangerous. Marcus brushed past the researcher and tapped a code into a console near one of the pods. I'll show you something that underscores my point, Ms. Reyes, about how progress sometimes demands privacy. The pod door hissed open, revealing canisters filled with a translucent substance. Marcus gestured at them. We've been developing a polymer for ballistic protection, among other applications. Valerie peered inside, noting the sophisticated engineering. Impressive, she allowed. But are these materials tested for health and environmental impact? Marcus's thin smile was a warning. Of course. Our scientists handle it. Argus has labs to ensure safety protocols are met. Yet something about his tone suggested he resented the very question. Valerie pressed gently, "May I see the data? Or is that confidential too?" He snorted. "It's out of your scope right now. Besides, it's proprietary. We won't risk corporate espionage." He closed the pod and moved on, as if the matter were settled. They continued deeper into the chamber, pausing occasionally while Mia pointed out various sections. At each stop, Marcus made sure to remind Valerie that Argus was treading the edge of innovation, implying that her push for transparent practices could hinder breakthroughs. She countered politely, emphasizing that thorough oversight needn't stifle progress. But each exchange felt like a duel, with neither side conceding ground. After some time, they reached a set of steel double doors labeled "Restricted Access." 2 armed guards stood watch. Marcus flashed a keycard, followed by a fingerprint scan. Once the doors slid open, the corridor beyond was dimmer, lined with observation windows on one side. Through the glass, Valerie could see rooms filled with specialized equipment, 3D printers, advanced robotic stations, and partially assembled devices. The hum of machinery here was louder, the atmosphere even more charged with secrecy. Tom Alden stepped into the corridor and spoke in a low voice. "We don't usually bring visitors here, sir," he said to Marcus. "Are we certain this is wise?" Marcus shot him a dismissive glance. "Ms. Reyes wants to see how Argus really operates. Let's give her a glimpse." He nodded toward a room labeled "Project Aurora." "You'll enjoy this one," he said, addressing Valerie with a note of sarcasm. Inside Project Aurora, a cluster of engineers hovered around a sleek apparatus that resembled a large, futuristic helmet. Cables ran from it to a console bristling with monitors. Valerie noticed swirling lights within the device, as if it contained some reactive element. One of the engineers hurriedly switched off a display as the group entered, clearly uncomfortable with the intrusion. "Neural interface research," Marcus announced, his voice echoing in the lab. "Potential applications range from medical rehabilitation to enhanced operational control. Imagine controlling drones or heavy machinery directly with thought." Harold's eyebrows shot up, impressed. Claire and Darren exchanged uneasy looks. Valerie gazed at the device, half in awe, half in concern. "Incredible," she said softly. "But if you're venturing into neural tech, the ethical considerations multiply. Regulation in this area is stringent: human trials, data privacy, consent. Are those aspects being addressed?" Marcus lifted his chin defiantly. "Argus invests in robust legal teams. We'll manage." Valerie met his gaze. "Managing legal hurdles isn't the same as respecting ethical boundaries." He frowned. "Spare me the sermon. We're forging the future here, Ms. Reyes. Not tiptoeing around squeamish moralists." Silence fell in the lab as the tension ratcheted up. One of the engineers coughed and pretended to review data on a tablet, clearly wishing to be elsewhere. Mia Bradshaw looked at her watch, as though eager to end the tour. Finally, Marcus exhaled sharply. "Enough. Let's wrap this up." He addressed Tom Alden. "See if everything's still fine in the rest of the facility, especially that sensor glitch. Then meet us in the conference room upstairs. I want to debrief." Tom nodded and departed, leaving the group to retrace their steps back to the elevator. Along the way, Valerie's mind spun with questions. Argus was pushing the limits of technology, some of it borderline militaristic, some invasive to personal autonomy. Yet Marcus seemed intent on keeping it all under wraps, refusing any notion of open transparency. As they ascended to the surface, the elevator ride felt long and claustrophobic. The group reconvened in a drab conference room near the main entrance, where a large table stood beneath a ceiling fan that did little to combat the desert heat. Marcus sat at the head, gesturing for everyone else to take seats around him. Harold, Claire, Darren, Mia, and Valerie arranged themselves, waiting for instructions. 2 security personnel lingered at the door, arms folded. Tom Alden slipped in a minute later, handing Marcus a small envelope. Marcus opened it, scanned its contents, and allowed himself a rare smile. "Good," he said, pocketing the paper. Then he cleared his throat and faced the group. "Today's visit was meant to clarify how Argus truly operates," he began. "We're not some philanthropic organization feeding on idealistic dreams. We advance, we break barriers, and yes, sometimes we tiptoe around conventional ethics to stay ahead." He turned his attention squarely on Valerie. "You've seen what we do here. I trust you realize now that your ethical blueprint might be out of step with our reality." Valerie took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I respect the achievements I've seen, Mr. Donovan. But I believe that forging ahead without strong ethical guidelines is a recipe for disaster. Public scandals, legal battles, or even internal sabotage could undo all your progress." His eyebrows flickered in annoyance. "That's one perspective. It's a perspective backed by empirical data," she countered. "Even in high-risk industries, accountability tends to foster more stable growth." Marcus looked like he wanted to argue further, but Tom Alden broke in softly, "Sir, we do have another meeting scheduled with the board in a few hours." Marcus's gaze swept around the table. "Very well. We'll head back to the resort. Ms. Reyes, you and I will have a private talk once we return. I suggest you prepare yourself to answer some hard questions, and to face hard truths." With that, he rose and strode out, the security personnel trailing in his wake. The rest of the group sat in strained silence. Eventually, Harold spoke up. "Valerie, that was something." She exhaled, relieved to have it over but still apprehensive about what came next. "He's not convinced. If anything, he seems even more determined to thwart my proposals." Claire reached over and gave Valerie's hand a reassuring squeeze. "You held your ground. That counts for something around here." Mia, who had remained fairly neutral throughout the tour, glanced at Valerie. "I've worked for Marcus Donovan for years. He's brilliant, but he can be ruthless when challenged. Watch yourself." Valerie's pulse quickened. She thanked Mia for the warning, then gathered her notes, preparing to leave. Outside, the desert sun blazed mercilessly. The day was far from over, and the shadow of Marcus Donovan's influence loomed larger than ever. Still, a spark of determination glowed within her. She had seen Argus's hidden corners, had glimpsed both the ambition and the peril behind its closed doors. Now, she had to figure out how to guide that ambition onto an ethically sustainable path before Marcus's iron will crush anyone who dared stand in his way. Marcus Donovan drove back to the resort in grim silence, Tom Alden at his side. A second SUV carried Valerie Reyes, Harold Fenton, Claire Hayes, and Darren Liu. The dust from the remote facility still clung to the vehicles, marking them as outsiders to the polished city they re-entered. As they neared the gates of the luxury resort, everyone felt the unspoken tension. Marcus's displeasure weighed heavily, and nobody knew how he might lash out next. Once inside the lavish lobby, Marcus commandeered a small meeting room overlooking a garden. He told Valerie to meet him there in 30 minutes, alone. "Don't be late," he ordered, before stalking off down a corridor. Tom Alden gave Valerie an inscrutable look, some mix of pity and warning, then followed Marcus out of sight. Harold and Claire seemed ready to protest, but Valerie shook her head. "I'll handle it," she murmured. "No need to escalate things further." Her words were steady, but her heart was pounding. She couldn't ignore the possibility that Marcus intended to corner her into submission or force her out of Argus Enterprises altogether. She freshened up quickly in her suite, splashing cold water on her face in a vain attempt to quell her nerves. Outside her window, palm trees rustled in the afternoon breeze, the tranquil scene a stark contrast to the conflict brewing within Argus's leadership. Steeling herself, she headed to the designated room. Marcus was already there, sipping mineral water. He'd changed into a crisp linen shirt and slacks, as if to project casual confidence. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows framed a manicured garden path. He motioned for Valerie to sit at a sleek wooden table, and she complied. "Close the door," he said. She did. Without preamble, he launched in. "You're making waves, Ms. Reyes. That was your intent from the start, wasn't it? To stir up discontent and then swoop in with your so-called solutions." Valerie maintained an even tone. "I was hired to offer a strategy that aligns Argus's growth with ethical guidelines. If that creates waves, maybe it's because there are systemic issues needing attention." He scoffed. "Systemic issues. I hear that phrase too often these days. You think you can waltz in and reorder how we operate, ignoring the blood, sweat, and tears I've poured into this empire?" His voice rose slightly, brimming with indignation. Valerie braced herself. "No one questions your dedication or accomplishments, Mr. Donovan. But as I mentioned before, ignoring potential pitfalls can lead to irreparable damage. Public opinion can shift overnight, especially if the media uncovers questionable dealings in your supply chains, your research, or your partnerships." Marcus's knuckles whitened around his glass. "You really think you can threaten me with media backlash? It's not a threat. It's reality. Look at recent corporate scandals. Massive companies toppled because they didn't adapt or address their wrongdoing." He set the glass down abruptly, the echo resonating in the quiet room. "I won't be lectured like a naive intern. Argus is my life's work, and I've protected it fiercely. If that means bending rules in certain markets or fast-tracking technology that isn't fully vetted, so be it. Our results speak for themselves." Valerie took a breath. "And if those results are overshadowed by a major scandal, what then? All your success, undone in a flash. My role isn't to sabotage Argus, it's to safeguard it." Marcus's scowl deepened. "Safeguard? Isn't that ironic? You barge in with ethics talk, but maybe your own moral high ground is an illusion. People who preach about fairness and integrity are often the first to exploit weaknesses for their own gain." She struggled to hold her composure. "I'm not here to exploit anything. My track record with past clients is transparent. All I want is for Argus to remain profitable without crossing lines that lead to self-destruction." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You truly believe that, don't you? That we can keep raking in billions while also wearing the halo of righteousness?" A bitter laugh escaped him. "Fine, Ms. Reyes. Show me how. Write it all up. I want a revised proposal that fits the real world, not a utopia. You have 48 hours. Valerie blinked. 48 hours. He stood, smoothing his shirt. "Is that a problem? You're the expert, after all. Surely you can adapt your grand plan to our actual conditions by then." Her mind raced. Drafting a thorough plan incorporating everything she'd learned at the secure facility, plus Argus's broader operations, in just 2 days was daunting. But refusing would be handing Marcus the justification to dismiss her. "I can do it," she said, mustering confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Excellent." Marcus walked to the window, gazing at the manicured garden. "One more thing. You'll have limited access to Argus's internal files, only what I approve. Don't expect me to open every door." Valerie exhaled slowly. "Understood." She stood and gathered her bag, preparing to leave. The door felt like both an exit and an entrance to a new level of conflict with Marcus Donovan. Before she could step away, he turned around, voice low. "Remember, Ms. Reyes, if your new plan doesn't convince me, you'll be gone." And any talk of ethics that threatens Argus's bottom line, well, you'll wish you'd never set foot on my jet. She met his gaze. I appreciate your candor, Mr. Donovan. My intention is to help, no matter how hostile you become. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked, a silent battle of wills. Then she slipped out. Her hands shook slightly as she walked down the hallway, adrenaline coursing through her. The ultimatum was clear: produce a feasible, real-world plan that aligned Argus's ambitions with her principles, or face Marcus's wrath. The clock was ticking. Upon returning to her suite, she found Harold, Claire, and Darren waiting, their expressions anxious. How did it go? Claire asked. Valerie slumped into a chair. He wants a revised plan, one that incorporates everything we saw at the facility, in 48 hours. Harold winced. That's insane. He's giving you hardly any time at all. Seems intentional, Darren remarked. He's hoping you'll fail. Valerie rubbed her temples. I suspect so. But I can't back down. They huddled around a small table, laptops open. Harold offered to help gather any Argus data he had access to, while Claire provided notes from board meeting minutes. Darren contributed financial analyses. Piece by piece, they formed a makeshift war room, determined to draft a comprehensive plan that addressed Argus's advanced research projects, potential international deals, and the ethical oversight needed to avoid disastrous fallout. The hours stretched into the evening, and they ordered room service to keep working. Sleep was a luxury Valerie couldn't afford. She typed incessantly, weaving together her existing blueprint with real-world constraints gleaned from the field visit. She balanced cost projections, market analyses, and regulatory frameworks, all while factoring in potential moral pitfalls. The deeper she dove, the more she realized how vast Argus's operations were. The company's reach spanned numerous sectors, from biotech to aerospace, each with its own ethical landmines. Harold occasionally paused to remind her of the internal culture Marcus fostered, a culture that prized rapid innovation over caution. Claire flagged areas where Argus had come under mild scrutiny in the past, offering insights on how to prevent those incidents from snowballing into major controversies. Darren pored over spreadsheets, identifying potential cost-saving measures that could justify the investments needed for robust oversight. They all worked with a sense of urgency, aware that the entire plan could be dismissed with a single wave of Marcus's hand if it didn't align perfectly with his demands. By midnight, Valerie's eyes burned from screen glare, and her wrist ached from typing. They decided to take a short break. Harold gently insisted Valerie get at least a few hours of sleep before continuing. The next day would bring more of the same, and by the end of the second night, the plan had to be ready. Before she headed to bed, her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number: watch your step. Donovan doesn't like being backed into a corner. She felt a chill run down her spine. Whether it was a warning or a threat remained unclear, but it underscored the severity of her situation. Stepping onto the balcony, she gazed at the moonlit pool below, the hum of distant conversation drifting through the night air. Tomorrow would be a gauntlet of research, edits, and last-minute recalculations. But for now, she let the cool breeze soothe her. She might be cornered, but she wasn't alone. Harold, Claire, and Darren had proved their loyalty. Maybe that would be enough to hold her steady against Marcus Donovan's storm. Sunlight crept into Valerie Reyes's suite, stirring her awake after only a handful of restless hours. She rose with a sense of determination forging through her fatigue. Day one of her 48-hour deadline had begun, and she had no time to waste. With a quick shower and a cup of strong coffee, she was back at the table where the team's makeshift command center awaited. Harold Fenton arrived first, hair slightly disheveled, clutching a stack of printed financial statements. Figured you'd want these in hard copy, he said, laying them down. Sometimes it's easier to visualize data off-screen. Thank you, Valerie replied, scanning the pages. Darren Liu and Claire Hayes arrived soon after, laptops in tow. They set up a station near the window, the glow of their screens adding to the suite's already bright interior. We've got a full day ahead of us, Darren said. Let's divide and conquer. I can handle cost analyses and ROI projections. Claire, maybe you can refine the risk management sections. And Harold, we'll need your corporate knowledge for the background context. Valerie nodded. Perfect. I'll be the point person weaving it all together, ensuring it reads as a cohesive plan. She paused, exhaling deeply. And let's remember, Marcus will be looking for any excuse to dismiss our work. We need to address every angle he might use as a counterargument. For hours, the suite buzzed with focused energy. Harold periodically dialed contacts within Argus, gleaning morsels of information about the company's clandestine ventures or pending deals. Claire pored over archived press releases, searching for patterns in how Argus responded to public scrutiny. Darren compiled international market data that cross-referenced with ethical performance indicators, building a case that robust oversight could indeed bolster long-term profit. Mid-morning, room service delivered pastries and more coffee. They barely paused to eat. Valerie scribbled notes on sticky pads and plastered them across her laptop's frame, determined not to miss any vital points. At one juncture, she grew concerned about how to incorporate Argus's more secretive research, like the neural interfaces or advanced drones, without stepping over confidentiality lines that Marcus guarded fiercely. We can't detail every prototype we saw, she murmured, brow furrowed. But we need to highlight the potential risks. If these technologies become controversial in the public eye, Argus could face backlash that tarnishes its entire brand. Harold drummed his fingers on the table. Let's speak in broader terms about sensitive R&D. We'll show how establishing an internal ethics panel could preempt issues before they explode. Claire nodded, typing swiftly. An ethics panel with real authority, not a token gesture. They'd have the power to halt projects if they cross certain thresholds. Valerie half smiled. Marcus will hate that. But if we don't propose it, we're handing him a plan with no teeth. As they worked, the clock ticked relentlessly. By lunchtime, the framework of the revised proposal looked promising. Valerie's outline included, 1. An ethics and compliance council with executive-level powers, 2. A phased approach to integrating transparent practices, 3. Guidelines for philanthropic partnerships that could counterbalance any negative PR from riskier endeavors, and 4. An assurance that the investment in ethical oversight could pay dividends in maintaining Argus's reputation, a key intangible asset. Darren ran a cost-benefit projection. Short-term costs might spike by 7 to 10%, but if properly executed, we could see brand loyalty and investor confidence rise, offsetting the initial outlay. Could we present case studies from other industries to underscore that point? Claire asked. Absolutely, Darren replied, pulling up data. We can reference 2 or 3 notable examples where ethical reforms led to increased shareholder value. Valerie typed feverishly, weaving the evidence into the narrative. She felt the tension in her shoulders, but also a growing sense of possibility. They were constructing a robust argument, one that a stubborn CEO couldn't easily dismiss, unless he was dead set on ignoring facts altogether. As dusk fell, they took a short break. Valerie stepped outside to stretch her legs and walked down a sunlit path lined with tropical plants. Her phone vibrated, a text from Harold, who'd stepped away to call his wife. Just got wind that Marcus is with Tom Alden, discussing next steps. Be prepared for a hostile reception tomorrow. Valerie's stomach clenched. She typed a quick thanks and returned to the suite. I hate to say it, but we have to consider the possibility that no matter how solid our plan is, Marcus might reject it out of sheer pride, she said as soon as everyone reconvened. We need a contingency. Something that forces him to give it a fair read. Claire hesitated. A pressure tactic? Like, pointing out that if he dismisses this outright, the board might see him as ignoring valuable input. Darren chimed in. Or referencing that external stakeholders, like major investors, are already demanding certain accountability measures. If he resists, it could alienate them. Harold frowned. That's risky. Marcus despises being cornered. If he feels we're threatening him, he might try to fire Valerie on the spot. Valerie nodded grimly. We have to strike a delicate balance, be firm about the consequences of ignoring ethics, but not so overt that he feels blackmailed. She massaged her temples. It's a fine line. They pushed on, each hour bringing them closer to the looming deadline. By midnight, the plan was nearly complete. Valerie insisted on a final sweep for clarity and cohesion, ensuring the language remained professional but unflinching. They proofread each section, verifying numbers and rechecking references. A beep from Claire's laptop signaled an email from an internal Argus mailing list, some innocuous update about next quarter's supply chain changes. Valerie glanced at it. We might integrate some of these supply chain changes into the plan's timeline, she suggested, scanning the details. Then her eyes narrowed. The email mentioned a pilot program in a developing country known for lax labor laws. This is exactly the kind of location where Argus's brand could suffer if exploitation is discovered, Valerie murmured, plugging the detail into the proposal's risk mitigation section. By the time they collectively deemed the document ready, dawn was breaking, bathing the sky in pale orange. They had less than a day left to polish any final touches and present it to Marcus Donovan. Exhausted yet resolute, they agreed to catch a few hours of sleep. We'll reconvene midday, finalize the deck, and then deliver it to him by the evening, Valerie said, yawning. Sleep didn't come easily. Valerie's mind churned with scenarios of how the next 24 hours might unfold. She worried about Tom Alden's involvement. He seemed fiercely loyal to Marcus and capable of dirty tactics if push came to shove. She also fretted about her own vulnerabilities, especially after receiving that ominous text. Yet she reminded herself that she had allies now. Harold, Claire, and Darren had proven their solidarity, risking their standing within Argus to help her craft a plan that could change the company for the better. When she awoke a few hours later, she found 3 messages on her phone. Harold, morning. Let's do this. Conference room at noon. Second text, frustration flickering in her eyes. Threats or warnings seemed to swirl around her at every turn, but she wouldn't be cowed. She dressed in a charcoal gray business suit, one that exuded professionalism without seeming ostentatious, and made her way to the hotel's private conference room. Harold, Claire, and Darren were already there, going over last-minute slides. Coffee cups littered the table. You okay? Claire asked, noticing Valerie's tight expression. Valerie managed a small smile. I will be. Let's finalize this. They spent the next few hours refining language, polishing data visuals, and rehearsing potential questions Marcus might hurl at them. Each slide was a testament to their collective expertise and their resolve to guide Argus onto a more sustainable path. By mid-afternoon, the plan was truly finished. They decided not to overwhelm Marcus with an overly lengthy document. Instead, they compiled a concise executive summary backed by appendices for deeper dives. The entire package was loaded onto a secure tablet that Valerie would hand him in person. The Redwood boardroom meeting was just hours away. The tension in the air was palpable. Valerie realized that the moment she walked into that room, she'd be stepping into a crucible, her entire professional future on the line. Marcus Donovan might well reject everything outright, or he could find enough merit to grudgingly keep her on. One thing was certain, she had no regrets. She had done the work, uncovered truths about Argus's operations, and laid out a path that balanced ambition with accountability. Let's do this, she said to her small team, voice steeled with determination. And they all nodded, equally resolute. One way or another, the next meeting would redefine Argus Enterprises, and potentially, all of their lives. Evening settled over the resort as Valerie Reyes approached the Redwood boardroom, the heart pounding in her chest a stark contrast to her calm demeanor. She clutched a tablet containing the revised proposal, determined not to show any hint of fear. Harold, Claire, and Darren had wished her luck, acknowledging that Marcus Donovan had insisted only she enter the room. She suspected he wanted a private confrontation. The boardroom's double doors gleamed under recessed lighting, and Valerie paused to steady herself. Inside, she found a massive oval table surrounded by high-backed chairs. At the far end sat Marcus Donovan, flanked by Tom Alden. A single vacant chair awaited her near the center. She swallowed hard, stepping forward. "Good evening, Mr. Donovan." "Tom," she said, inclining her head. Marcus offered the faintest nod. "Ms. Reyes. You have something to show us?" Valerie placed the tablet on the table. "Yes. This is the revised plan you requested. It addresses Argus Enterprises' expansion in practical, quantifiable ways, integrating ethical oversight without hampering core growth." Tom Alden folded his arms. "We'll see about that." Marcus tapped the screen, scanning the document's contents. His expression remained impassive, but Valerie noticed his jaw tense whenever he flipped to a new section. At times, he leaned over to whisper to Tom, who merely grunted in reply. The minutes stretched, each second intensifying the swirl of unease in Valerie's stomach. Finally, Marcus leaned back. "You've incorporated a so-called Ethics and Compliance Council, proposed advanced risk assessments for every new project, and even suggested philanthropic partnerships to offset negative PR. Ambitious, Ms. Reyes." She clasped her hands in her lap. "It's a framework that's worked for other major corporations tackling similarly high-stakes industries." Tom Alden's stare was cold. "You're basically demanding Argus slow down to meet moral checkpoints. If we hit a prime opportunity, we can't afford bureaucratic delays." Valerie inhaled. "I understand the need for swift action in competitive markets. But without guardrails, one major scandal could cost Argus far more in lawsuits, fines, and lost investor confidence." Marcus tapped the table lightly. "So your stance is basically, adopt these measures, or risk downfall. Correct?" She met his gaze. "Yes, that's the core message. But it's also an invitation to innovate responsibly, to turn Argus into a world leader recognized for both profitability and ethical foresight." Silence followed, thick as fog. Marcus's mouth tightened into a thin line, and Tom's glare could have cut glass. At length, Marcus rose from his chair, circling the table until he stood inches behind Valerie. She remained motionless, fighting the urge to recoil under his looming presence. "You've done a lot of research, Ms. Reyes," he murmured. "Learned about Argus's hidden corners, saw our secure facility, and still, you press for these changes. I suppose I should admire your nerve." Valerie's voice came out steady. "I believe in what I've put forward, Mr. Donovan." He let out a humorless chuckle. "I also see you've included footnotes referencing some of Argus's riskier ongoing projects. That's privileged information. Where did you get those details?" She swallowed. "Your own internal data, cross-referenced with industry reports. I took care not to reveal anything classified. It's the only way to outline real solutions." Marcus exchanged a pointed look with Tom. After a moment, he waved a hand dismissively. "All right, Ms. Reyes. Here's the decision. We'll move forward with parts of your plan, enough to show good faith to our board and quell any external criticisms." His tone dripped with reluctance. "But make no mistake, if any portion of this strategy hinders our bottom line, I'll scrap the entire thing." Relief and wariness collided in Valerie's chest. "I appreciate the compromise," she said. "I'll support the implementation process in any way I can." Tom Alden cleared his throat. "What about oversight? You propose a council with real veto power. That seems excessive." Marcus tapped a finger against the proposal. "We'll implement a watered-down version. An advisory group, not a council with the ability to stop my decisions." Valerie opened her mouth to protest, but Marcus shot her a glare. "That's non-negotiable. Either accept that or walk away." Her heart sank. This was only a partial victory. Marcus was co-opting her plan, weakening crucial elements to maintain absolute control. But if she refused, all her work would be for nothing. She forced a nod. "I'll refine that section." "Fine," he said, stepping back to his seat. "Draft the changes tonight. I expect a final copy by morning." Tom Alden reached for the tablet, apparently eager to confirm the adjusted terms. Valerie stood, aware that her position remained precarious. She'd gained a foothold in Argus's future, but Marcus still held every advantage. As she turned to leave, Marcus stopped her. "One more thing, Ms. Reyes. Watch your step around my operations. You're part of the team now, but don't overstep your boundaries." She managed to keep her face neutral. "Understood, Mr. Donovan." Exiting the Redwood boardroom, Valerie finally allowed herself to exhale. She'd succeeded in preventing Marcus from dismissing her outright, but at a cost. The ethical reforms would be diluted, and she was still under his watchful eye. Yet, a glimmer of hope lingered. If she could build on this compromise, Argus might inch closer to the responsible corporate culture she believed it could achieve, despite the strongmen pulling the strings at the top. Valerie Reyes worked through the night, making the final adjustments Marcus had demanded. She reluctantly weakened certain oversight provisions, transforming what had once been a robust ethics and compliance council into a mere advisory committee. Each alteration felt like a betrayal of her core principles, but she remembered the tight line of Marcus's mouth, his threat that if she pushed too far, he'd destroy the entire effort. By dawn, she had a revised version. Harold, Claire, and Darren reviewed it with tired eyes, sharing her frustration. They were well aware that this watered-down plan might fail to address the biggest pitfalls facing Argus Enterprises. Yet if they didn't concede to Marcus's demands, everything would be lost. "We can treat it like a stepping stone," Harold suggested. "Better some oversight than none at all." Shortly after, she delivered the final copy to Marcus Donovan, who was meeting with a handful of senior board members in a private suite. Tom Alden took the flash drive from her without comment. Valerie waited outside, bracing herself for whatever might follow. After an hour, Marcus emerged, his expression stoic. "The board sees merit in these recommendations, Ms. Reyes," he said evenly. "We'll proceed on a trial basis. I expect you to oversee implementation, under my direct supervision, of course." He offered a small, cold smile. "Welcome to Argus Enterprises in an official capacity." A wave of cautious relief washed over Valerie. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan. I'll do my best to ensure success." He nodded, then lowered his voice so only she could hear. "Don't think you've won. I'm giving you a narrow runway. If this plan stalls our profits or stirs controversy, you'll be the one we cut loose." Despite his intimidation, Valerie managed to nod. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with sabotage attempts, power plays, and constant scrutiny. But at least now she had an official standing within Argus. From that position, she could chip away at the entrenched culture of unchecked ambition. Word spread quickly through the organization that Marcus Donovan had adopted a portion of Valerie's proposals. While many employees remained skeptical of any true change, a subtle sense of possibility emerged, particularly among those who'd grown uneasy with Argus's secretive ways. Some mid-level managers reached out to Valerie, offering quiet support or discreet intel on how to strengthen accountability processes. Others expressed wariness, fearing retaliation from Marcus or Tom Alden if they spoke too openly. In the weeks that followed, Valerie set up initial meetings for the newly formed advisory committee, composed of a few Argus executives willing to champion transparency. She collaborated with Harold, Claire, and Darren to craft training modules that introduced ethical considerations into departmental decisions. Bit by bit, a fresh perspective began seeping into the company's routine operations. Of course, Marcus remained a constant presence, asserting his authority at every turn. He challenged every guideline Valerie introduced, mocking any measure he deemed overly cautious. And Tom Alden lurked in the background, quietly undermining efforts by withholding data or pressuring employees to bypass certain checks. Yet, Valerie persisted. Each small victory, be it a new reporting channel for employee concerns or a revised procurement policy, felt like a step closer to meaningful reform. Occasionally, she recalled the threats and warnings she'd received. But as her sphere of influence expanded, it grew less likely that Argus could dismiss her without attracting unwanted attention. Over time, some board members even started to see the value in the incremental changes, particularly when potential PR crises were averted through swift internal action. In a turn of irony, the very plan Marcus had tried to dilute became a modest success story within Argus, earning cautious praise from certain departments that benefited from improved processes. Though the transformations were far from the comprehensive overhaul Valerie had envisioned, they laid a foundation she hoped to build upon. One afternoon, as she was reviewing internal compliance reports, Marcus appeared unannounced. "So," he said, leaning against her office doorway, arms folded. "The plan's surviving. I didn't think it would last this long." Valerie set aside her papers. "Neither did I, if I'm being honest. But it's working in small ways." He studied her for a moment, then nodded curtly. "Keep it that way, small. If it grows too large and threatens my leadership, we'll have a problem." She met his gaze, unwavering. "Understood, Mr. Donovan." He left without another word, footsteps echoing in the hallway. Despite his cautions, Valerie allowed herself a rare smile. She had navigated his traps and intimidation, carving out a space where ethics could breathe within Argus Enterprises. The work was far from finished, major hurdles remained. Yet, with perseverance and a dedicated team, she believed they could steer the company toward a more balanced path. In the end, Valerie Reyes hadn't toppled Marcus Donovan's empire, nor had she crowned herself its savior. Instead, she occupied a crucial middle ground, slowly but surely influencing Argus from within. And though danger still lurked in every compromise, her resolve never wavered. Progress, no matter how incremental, was still progress.